Welcome to Oh God, What Now? I'm Dorian Lynskey. We are halfway to the millennium, not in the apocalyptic Christian sense, but in the arguably more important podcast sense. You are listening to the 500th episode of Oh God, What Now, the podcast formerly known as Romaniacs. To celebrate, we will be asking the public to throw street parties from Land's End to John O'Groats. But meanwhile, on this show, to mark our Romaniac roots, we'll be counting down the top 10 Brexit villains. Then, as special guest, migration and refugee expert Zoe Gardner will help us understand the politics of immigration and how a Labour government might change both the system and the conversation. And in the extra bit for Patreon backers, why are MPs swearing so much right now? And do we give a shit? Let's meet the panel. Rafael Behr is a Guardian columnist, author of Politics: A Survivor's Guide, and host of the Politics on the Couch podcast. Hello, Raf.
Hi, Dorian.
So there was a remarkable PMQs earlier today. The mother of the murdered trans girl, Brianna Ghey, was in the House of Commons, not in the chamber, but everybody thought that she was. And Keir Starmer mentioned this. And then Rishi Sunak, in a kind of obviously pre-scripted list of things that Starmer had U-turned on, threw in an anti-trans joke, which Starmer then called out. And everything, the reaction blew up. Then Sunak's spokesman doubled down and said, no, that was totally legit. And then Kemi Badenoch weighed in and accused Starmer of point scoring when she had done so much personally to take the heat out of this issue. What are they playing at?
The question suggests that there's some kind of strategic intelligence to this, which clearly there isn't. I mean, I suppose it's a kind of a rational calculation in hard-hearted Westminster land that once the Prime Minister has made a mistake, and very obviously this was a terrible, crass mistake, and you like to think that as a human being he would just be sort of flinching forever when he recalls having said something that he clearly shouldn't have said. The judgment is you just never apologise, never explain, double down, it'll blow over. It just looks too weak to admit that the Prime Minister just said something appalling. What I think is interesting about it, I mean, and it was, we had to be clear here, regardless of where people stand in the sort of abstract argument about trans rights or in terms of questions of self-ID, these things, they're just on a human level to make a kind of glib joke about this in the context of someone who's been murdered and the murder victim's mother is in the House of Commons at the time. He should be cringing for the rest of his life recalling that moment. And what was interesting is that Keir Starmer, who I don't think is a terribly agile politician, and also someone who, like Sunak, over relies on script, actually was able to, I think, respond with what seemed like pretty authentic shock and outrage. And I do think, to his credit, he is someone who is quite old-fashioned in the sense of what public service ought to be. And he used to get genuinely quite affronted by Boris Johnson's turpitude. And I think he was sincerely shocked at what Sunak had done. And my sense is, and in fact, I was talking to someone who knows the Downing Street operation quite well about this afterwards, and said, it's basically a terrible operation. They have no agility. They won't have thought this through at all. And that Sunak will be immensely angry and he'll end up blaming whoever gave him that script rather than blaming himself for not having thought it through. But I think there's no question that it looks terrible on him and reflects just badly on him, both as a political performer and just as a character who's unable to adjust and respond to circumstance appropriately.
Well, Nicola Sturgeon made the point that this is not the first time that Sunak has made a comment like that. It's the first time that Starmer has pushed back, and it's obvious why. Because of the sort of empathy for this particular individual. But do you think that this could be a bit of a turning point in the normalization of this language, that he's actually sort of being compelled to point it out? Because then you have to go, well, why is it okay to make this remark if that person isn't in the building?
Yeah, I think there is a dawning realization, I think, in Westminster that even though people might have quite strong views, as I say, in sort of the abstract on the extent to which trans rights should be rolled out and where, and sort of policy questions of single-sex spaces and various, I think, or participation in sport. These are sort of policy questions, and that's can be quite a polarized issue. Actually, it's actively wanting to be spiteful and horrible to trans people is a tiny, tiny minority view. Most people are just decent, normal humans who recognize that it's complicated. And I do think that the sort of willful, more aggressive culture warrior side of this that wants to stir it up, wants to capitalize on it, is discovering that's really not only is it not where the British public is, it's not where their voters are. And I think actually Kemi Badenoch recognises that, which is why she has sort of understood she has to calibrate this a little bit better than some people in her party have done.
Ros Taylor is the host of Jam Tomorrow and the author of The Future of Trust, out very soon. Hello, Ros.
Hello, Dorian.
In scary robot news, Meta's Oversight Committee has ruled that a Facebook video implying that Joe Biden is a paedophile does not violate its manipulated media rules because it doesn't use AI. But the committee also said that these rules are incoherent and confusing because, of course, there was misinformation before AI. So after all the fuss about disinfo during the 2016 and 2020 campaigns, have the social media giants learned anything that can make us feel better about this election year?
Not necessarily. I mean, it's an interesting question, isn't it? What happens when AI tells you that it's not AI? I'm looking forward to that day. Anyway, yes, they have learned quite a lot. They've learned that they really need to get politics off their public platforms. And they are realising that now, that it's a massive liability, and particularly with the advent of deepfakes. And deepfakes that are increasingly hard to spot, because that's the problem. Hitherto, deepfakes have not been too difficult to call out, but now they're just getting harder and harder to identify. And that, of course, means it's harder and harder for the platforms themselves to identify them, let alone the public. But this realisation that they need to stop doing politics as much as possible on social media platforms is why Facebook has massively downgraded news, and why, as a consequence, many media publications are very unhappy with the exposure that they're now getting on Facebook. Why you can't have paid political campaigning on TikTok, for example, it's not allowed, and why parties are increasingly turning to WhatsApp, because that's a closed system. We don't know what's happening in WhatsApp to other people that we can't see. Therefore, it's a safer bet in terms of media scrutiny of what they're doing. I mean, the bigger question, of course, is if this political debate is not happening on social media now, and perhaps it shouldn't be happening there because it's just become too toxic, then where is it going to happen among younger generations who aren't listening to exciting podcasts, watching TV news, listening to the radio, reading newspapers? Where are they going to talk about politics?
I don't think there are young people who don't listen to podcasts. What? They're the best. Our guest this week is a leading campaigner and expert on UK and EU migration and refugee laws. You may have seen her fighting the good fight on your TV screens. It's Zoe Gardner. Hi, Zoe.
Hi, Dorian.
King Charles has been diagnosed with cancer and has stepped away from royal duties to get treatment. Can you explain why this is Harry and Meghan's fault?
Wow, putting me on the spot. No, it's not. I think the whole question of how Harry and Meghan are treated in the media is, and also just like I've started watching The Crown, actually. Maybe that's where I should start with this. I'm late to the party, but I've started watching The Crown, and it's made me think that like this is just some kind of sick social experiment. And you know, I actually worry about the human rights of the people involved in the family as well. I mean, I don't think that this is working for any of us. And I think, you know, when people have used this, you know, nobody wishes cancer on anybody, I would hope. But when people have used this to talk about like the issues facing people on waiting lists for NHS treatment and operations and diagnoses and so on, how it's sort of framed as some kind of unacceptable attack on a frail old man's health and so on, and how we talk about this family is just so totally disconnected to reality in any way, shape or form. It doesn't make sense. I don't understand it. I don't even want to go near it, to be honest.
So because of the Sunak news, we are unable to discuss the popular conservatism launch of Liz Truss, but I'm sure this very important movement will pop up again in future episodes. Before we get into the main show, a quick word about Patreon. Support from listeners like you is how we've got to 500 episodes. It's the reason we've been able to hire young producers and researchers, launch out other podcasts, including Roz's Jam Tomorrow and my very own origin story, and stay proudly independent. And we're really grateful for everything that you've chipped in. Unfortunately, the podcast economy is becoming harsher, and we're going to need your support more than ever. We know the economy is no picnic for anybody, but if you do want to keep us in rude health, and you can spare the money, please do consider supporting us on Patreon for as little as £3 a month. You'll get every episode a day early and ad-free, plus access to bonus content and merchandise. Search Patreon, Oh God What Now, or look at the link in the show notes. Thank you. Like I said, this is our 500th episode. We began in May 2017 with a real axe to grind about Brexit, I have to say. We just didn't like it. So for old time's sake, we're going to revisit the years of pain and count down our top 10 worst Brexit people, most of whom we would never even have heard of if things had gone a bit differently in June 2016. Obviously, revulsion is subjective, but we've roughly ranked them in order of power and influence. Here we go. At number 10, we have young-ish, he's now 30, Darren Grimes, to represent the new class of Brexit media grifters. Roz, why is he representative?
Darren Grimes is quite fascinating, actually. You know, he's northern, he's kind of slightly authentically working class, he's gay, he's got that, you know, man of the people vibe going on. He could be Lee Anderson's nephew, right? Yeah, he's young, and that's the important thing, because most Brexiteers in the past have been quite ageing, quite posh, quite straightforward, shall we say, in that way. It's quite straight, but he isn't, and that adds something new to the mix. Now, he's not an expert on anything, he doesn't pretend to be, but he channels the common sense vibe, and he's also benefited from his very early career. I won't even say career, because I think he was still at university at the time, when he was campaigner for the Lib Dems. And this is something that you find quite often among Brexiteers. They've been involved with the Lib Dems. When I was doing the research, and they've switched over. And what that actually gives them, I think, is an understanding of how people on the left think, which means that they can be slightly more effective at attacking them than that they might otherwise be. So yeah, he's remarkable, Darren Grimes.
Is it Brexit that laid the foundation for GB News and this sort of American-style conservative news bubble?
Yeah, it was, but not perhaps in the way you would expect, because GB News didn't start till 2021, right? And it started with Andrew Neil, and he, of course, dropped out after a while because he just found it too extreme for him. But what you had in 2021 was a realisation that Brexit had not really gone all that well. We had left. The promised benefits were not coming out. Okay, we'd had COVID, which was going to get in the way, but all the same, what next? How do you consolidate that right-wing populism when it clearly had an appeal, or they wouldn't have won the referendum, but the big project was failing? Where do you take that next? Well, the answer to that is you set up an alternative media empire, and that's what Sir Paul Marshall, also used to be a Lib Dem, and Legartum did in setting up GB News. And Martin Daubney as well, another former left-winger. And one of the purposes of GB News almost is basically to try and drive out mainstream TV news coverage. And they are very explicit about that. So not only do they hate the BBC, but if you look at Darren Grimes recently, he's also been spending a lot of time having a go at Sky News.
So what we've learned is that Lib Dems are like sort of cuddly little mogwai, and if you're not careful, they will turn into gremlins. Yeah, well, I think people realise after a while, I might believe it at one point, but hell, I'm never going to get any power. How can I get power? I've seen power, now I want it. Where can I go to get power? At number 9, it's Andrew Bridgen, the Tory MP turned freelance conspiracy theorist for North West Leicestershire. Raf, without Brexit, would he have been just a face in the crowd? We just never know who he was.
Well, there's always a vacancy in the chamber of the House of Commons for people to pontificate about their hobby horses and make a spectacle of themselves in that very specific arena. And you can imagine him possibly having been one of those people. I mean, Peter Bone I put in this category as well. I mean, Peter Bone was known in the chamber of the House of Commons as someone who would just make a nuisance of themselves, filibustering perfectly decent measures that other people wanted to vote for and saying very right-wing things. And Mark Francois also in this category, these people who I think would have been sort of in the theatre of parliamentary democracy, the sort of second spear carrier somewhere on the side of the stage. And then suddenly they were thrust centre stage. And the reason it happened, I mean, essentially is that, I mean, so much of Brexit was just bad policy and sort of irrational and unrealisable in terms of its aspirations. It was a sort of, it was founded in fantasy. And the argument that you should try and implement it as if it was practical policy, if you tried to have that conversation, you would have excluded all sorts of people, and it would be very difficult to actually find people to go on the media and defend it and talk about it. And I experienced this. I would go on television programs and radio programs as the sort of Remainer voice, and they couldn't find a sort of an equivalently reasonable sounding lever because it was so hard.
I like the way you specified that you're not reasonable, but you're reasonable sounding.
Yeah, well, plausible sounding, exactly. I could do an affectation of sort of seeing both sides of these things. They couldn't find that sort of symmetrical sort of analytical, I would say, approach. You needed people who would just say any old thing and then call it balance, and that suddenly thrust these people into prominence who really, and I do blame the aspiration to a kind of false balance here a little bit. I mean, it's a bit like, I remember someone saying, if the story was a NASA rocket being launched, having spoken to the astrophysicist, you wouldn't then get someone who doesn't believe in gravity to come on for balance. But that's what you ended up doing with Brexit. You needed people who didn't believe in gravity to come and put the other side, and that really gave prominence to these people. I mean, I was just struck the other day, actually, when the argument was now about the Rwanda bill and leaving the ECHR, and some of these people who had sort of slightly drifted back into irrelevance where they belonged suddenly were back out there, and Mark Francois was there, I think I described like a sort of a bead of sweat reappearing, glistening on the forehead of Westminster politics, because that was the tone that the debate had taken. It was suddenly giving us all these Brexit flashbacks.
Number 8, not one person but a whole crew, the Lexiters, who thought that Brexit would be a coup for socialism. Amazingly, that was not the case. Zoe, this is your choice. Do you think many of them had a change of heart?
I think, like most of the rest of the country, nobody thinks it went well exactly. I think I deliberately didn't want to pick out an individual here because I'm actually not very keen to shit on the sort of left-wing people who believe in a better future and had legitimate criticisms to make of the EU and how it functions, in particular, for example, as regards how it treats refugees and migration, which is what I care most about. But I do think that it's interesting to look at what the Lexiters were part of, which is, I think, sort of two tendencies actually that have become much more prevalent and much more important in our politics at the moment. One is just a refusal to adhere to basic objective reality. And the other, which I think we really need to keep at the front of our minds now, is that it's kind of what you said, Ros, about how, people work with the Lib Dems and believe in that and then give up because they don't think they're going to get power. I think for a very long time, those of us who are more to the left or believe very strongly in principles of human rights and the need for collective emancipation and so on, have just sort of clung to the lesser evil and clung to a status quo that is quite obviously unsatisfactory in the hope that we won't lose what little we have and let things get much, much worse. And I think that was a major failure of the Remain campaign as a whole, which was just to fail to present a vision for how things could be different and better. And I think that has continued now. If you don't give people a vision, an idea of how to change the world for the better, and you keep just saying, just hang on to what we have, it's not great, but it could be worse, well, you give them a chance to shake things up and they will. And, that's obviously continued, and it looks like it might be a serious issue again with Biden versus Trump. And I think that also looking forwards for us, if Labour get in, but fail to provide real change, real vision, impactful and in some cases radical policy changes in order to address that failure of the status quo, then we're going to look at people looking at an insurgent far right here and say, well, the sort of soft liberal option didn't give us the change we wanted, and they're going to look for more radical change. So I think that's what the Lexiter lesson is. And they weren't the cause of Brexit, but I'm sure if it hadn't been a movement, then, it was a close run bet, and maybe we could have changed things if we'd had a bit more vision, a bit of more willingness to imagine the world differently and to actually fight for that.
At number 7, more rankling, with Brexit economist Patrick Minford, a Thatcherite who also has the honour of being Liz Truss's favourite economist. Ros, remind us of what are politely called his maverick views.
Well, Patrick Minford was a leading light in something called Economists for Brexit. There were lots of different things for Brexit.
Was Economists for Brexit just Patrick Minford?
No, there were others. I edited and published some of them on the LSE Brexit blog because, we published a wide spectrum of views. There were also loads of them, historians for Brexit, it went on and on. But it was it was an influential group. I mean, basically, his argument, his recommendation, shall we say, was that after Brexit, we shouldn't strike new trade deals. We should abolish all import tariffs. Now, you can imagine this might not go down very particularly well with certain people in Britain, farmers, for example, anybody who didn't really want their sector to be eaten up, by foreign competition. But that was his shtick, and he accepted that this would do terrible things to manufacturing and wage inequality. But he thought that the resulting shake-up would basically, shake Britain out of its torpor. And the great advantage of, having these beliefs is that you can argue it's never been tried. Just like Liz Truss argues now that her great plan was never fully tried because the markets turned against her. And she had to she had to reverse it all. And had they stuck with it, then we would be in a very, very different place and Britain would be booming. So, yeah, it's... The reason why I would mention him is that he acquired so much credibility, and Minford is a very good corrective to the idea that some people might have that because you work at a university and you're a professor, that you aren't susceptible to motivated reasoning. You absolutely are, on every side of the political debate, and he no less than anybody else.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want, obviously, universities come under a lot of attack, and I don't want to join in that attack, but some of the worst opinions in the world come from academics.
Well,
it's certainly a thing.
Yeah, I mean, having a professor in front of your name, is certainly a powerful thing, but it can be abused.
And number 6, it's Don't Call Them Hoovers maker James Dyson, one of a number of celebrities and businessmen who supported Brexit. Raf, why is he so annoying?
Well, I mean, I suppose people are entitled to their view, and if you're a prominent figure, and James Dyson is so iconic because of the Hoovers and the surprisingly powerful hand dryers, and so I can't, in a sense, hold his democratic opinion against him. What I find slightly irritating about the phenomenon is that this is someone who's in the business literally of manufacturing, and to have therefore advocated a position that took the UK out of the single market and the customs union. It was so... I mean, the only word I can think of is just stupid. It was such a colossally stupid thing to do. There's also, interestingly, he'd had a bit of beef with the EU over some regulations that, in terms of the environmental protections that apply particularly, I think, to basically vacuum cleaners that have bags, and his don't. And he got into an argument. And so... And he actually won a case at the European Court, but then didn't get any compensation for it. So there's an element of just like petty spite that goes into this. And that, I just think that is not the basis on which to use your public authority to advocate something that's basically going to harm the economy.
One thing Remainers have often been told is, of course, you should welcome people, into the fold who have changed their mind. But it does annoy me to see on the music front, people like Roger Daltrey and Bruce Dickinson, who were adamant on the specific point that Brexit would not harm touring musicians, and who are now complaining that it has harmed touring musicians and can the government do something about it? And it is very much the leopard's face-eating party. And it really annoys me. It's like, well, it's a bit late now. And number 5, it's Posh and Brex. Partners in Love and Brexit, journalist Isabel Oakeshott and Reform UK leader Richard Tice. Zoe, Tice I had never heard of before 2016. Now he leads a party that regularly gets 10% or more in the polls. So, I mean, could we say that he's one of the only people in the country who is really won big from the Brexit years?
Well, he's certainly bringing in the grift, but I think, there's plenty of sort of financial speculators who have done really, really well out of Brexit as well. I think he's not alone. I think what's particularly pathetic about Tice is that he's just he's seen a model that works well, Big Daddy Farage, and he wants to do the same. And so now he's shouting nonsense from the sidelines, but he's not as good of a politician. And you see that because his positions actually, apart from the ones that are just stupid, ill thought through nonsense to say something like the net zero migration thing that he and Oakeshott go on about, also totally out of pace with even Brexiters who remain Brexiters to this day, making a very, very outright cultural argument against migration. Stone Age, and so he's even more pathetic from that perspective. So yes, he is benefiting. He's building a career and a very lucrative career. I don't really understand the workings of the Reform Party, but I understand it's basically a business model, not a normal political party. And he's certainly a very rich man who's continuing to make a lot of money and be heard and gain power. So yeah, but I still can't help but look at him and think, wow, yeah, I wouldn't want to be you. Wouldn't want to be anything like you, because you are such a small person, and you can see it that he knows it.
And Oakeshott, I think, as a terrible journalist, and also representative of the way that in Britain that you can continue to be a journalist and sort of billed as such on TV and taken semi-seriously, despite the fact that you are in a relationship with the leader of a political party. And number 4, it's pseudo-brainiac Dan Hannan vying with Dominic Cummings for the title of not as clever as he thinks he is, but we're going to deny Dom the limelight this time. Roz, like me, do you enjoy rereading old Hannan pieces about how wonderful Brexit Britain will be? The utopian fiction.
You mean Baron Hannan, don't you? Give him his proper title, Dorian. Yes, of course. He's been ennobled now. Yes. It's not altogether fair to call him a pseudo-brainiac. Daniel Hannan is a very clever man. He's also quite a naive man. He's not really as much of an opportunist as a grifter as your normal Brexiteer. And he's long been opposed to membership. He has never been a Liberal Democrat, to my knowledge. He sat in the European Parliament for many years. He knows whereof he speaks. Now he thinks we should have stayed in the single market, which is nice to know. He's very much been on a journey. But fundamentally, Daniel Hannan is too naive for this shameless Brexit world he was sucked into. He had values, and those values could not be adapted to to the project. And he's sort of semi-detached from it as a result.
There was a brilliant piece, very short piece, written once by Matthew Paris about Daniel Hannan, who described him as a phenomenon that Paris himself recognised, having grown up not in the UK, but in a former UK colony, and which I think is the case with Hannan as well, and was steeped in this sort of nostalgic idea of the motherland, of what Britain is, that you only get when you're in somewhere, as in Matthew Paris's case, it was Rhodesia back in the day. It sort of encapsulates an idea of Britishness that is so... It cultivates this sort of anti-modern Britain-ness that I think only Paris, knowing it himself and having sort of repudiated it, really nailed in Daniel Hannan's worldview.
Yeah, he is a weirdly compelling figure.
Yeah, I think he grew up in Peru, actually, which I don't think has ever been a British colony, but it's sufficiently far from Britain that I agree, Raf, you would
it's
get...
the expat phenomenon.
Yes.
It's that sense of having an idea of the motherland elsewhere being in aspect in your imagination.
Well, Paddington grew up in Peru, and he's very British. So, at number 3, David Frost, aka 1960s Batman villain Baron Frost. Raf. He is a former Remainer and former ambassador to Denmark. He's been on quite a journey, hasn't he?
I'm fascinated by David Frost. Well, first of all, let's just start at the end. The deal he negotiated, it was terrible. So you should be angry with him literally on terms of just having given away everything on trade, got nothing on services. It's just objectively for the UK economy, it was a terrible, terrible deal that he did for Boris Johnson. But also, I think sort of more fascinating is the fact that he came from the Foreign Office. He argued in his capacity actually as a lobbyist for the Scotch Whisky Association for membership of the single market. He recognised this was after he'd left the Foreign Office. So he understood entirely the case for Remain. And then essentially what seems to have happened is he sort of hit the ceiling of his sort of natural capabilities, both in the diplomatic service. He just sort of wasn't promoted by all accounts because he was pretty mediocre. He would say that because it was a sort of Europhagic empire that obviously didn't recognise his true talents. And then he drifted into sort of Boris Johnson's orbit somehow, and then discovered the thrill of political activism and ideological conviction. And someone who's worked with him and knows him quite well, I think, did this sort of cod psychoanalysis, which is that he sort of behaves like someone who discovers student politics as their midlife crisis. So he does a sort of he became incredibly giddy and intoxicated by all the attention he was getting as someone who was now, up there with the Jacob Rees-Mogg in that world and getting
all the way
millions of
up
likes
there
on Twitter. But in that milieu, that was, that's rock and roll, right? For someone like that, like he's a Dickensian character. I think he wouldn't be out of place in a Dickens novel or a Chekhov short story as this weird clerk who somehow finds himself at the center of something much bigger and gets overly intoxicated by it.
After your psychoanalysis of Barons Frost and Hannon, I can see why you present a podcast called Politics on the Couch. This is very revealing.
Brexit was all about psychology. It's the only way to understand so much of it, and that's true of Remainers as well. By the way, our nostalgias, our romances, it just unleashed something deep in the British psyche on both sides of the argument.
And number 2, no surprises, it's Daily Mail columnist and after-dinner speaker Boris Johnson. Roz, he replaced Theresa May and won the 2019 election off the back of Brexit. But even now, I'm not sure how deeply he believed in it. I looked through his archive of Mail columns since last August, and it's only in the headline of one of them. Looking back, what do you think Brexit meant to him?
There isn't much that means stuff to Boris Johnson. It is all just a means to an end, to the greater power and publicity for Boris Johnson. It's true that he had long been a Eurosceptic. I mean, when he was Telegraph correspondent in Brussels, he was writing Eurosceptic stuff. But that was just, as he put it, I think, to throw stones into the greenhouse and listen to the shout when they went through and the smash. He just liked being provocative. And it was purely for personal advancement. In fact, I think perhaps no one except a man who so clearly wasn't a Brexit headbanger and true believer could have actually obtained Brexit, because he made it a fun experiment that a reasonably intelligent person could support. Now, I say that in inverted commas, right? But that was how he presented it. Something that, let's just give it a go. And that was really how it was won, because although I think our number one person was the main driver, it was only with Johnson that this was able. He was able to actually drive it through and make it something that your average Briton would think, oh yeah, let's give it a go.
I have to say, I think that when Boris Johnson inevitably tunes in to this podcast, as he does every week, I just really take some pleasure in imagining how annoyed he is that he's not number one and he's only number 2. So that is some comfort.
Well, number 1, top of the populists, can only be Nigel Farage. Zoe, he has been called the most consequential British politician of his era. Is that regrettably true, do you think?
Deeply regrettably, it probably is. And I mean, what Farage has done more than anybody else is shift the Overton window of what is acceptable, what is the space of what is possible, what is considered, decent in politics. And I think that it still amazes me that he was smart enough to do it this way. He, unlike Johnson, did not pay the price, is still massively influential, if not more than ever. Johnson did lose his crown and was disgraced, and I'm sure he's planning his glorious comeback, but for the time being, Farage is still there, being looked up to by huge numbers of people, driving the policy of the government by his own words. And when you look at what has come about since Brexit and why many of the reasons why so many people think it's been a failure, well, one of the major ones has obviously been the catastrophic outcomes in terms of refugee policy in the UK, refugee risks being taken, the smuggling across the channel, all of that, absolutely disastrous and significant increase in numbers of asylum seekers. Well, that after Nigel Farage campaigned on the back of that Breaking Point poster where he said, we must leave the EU because that will free us from the responsibility of having to care for the world's refugees. The fact that has slid off him like Teflon, that hasn't stuck, and that people do not see the grift and the lie and the fact that it was always just saying the thing to whip up the hate, that to get the result, and never ever any basis in any kind of truth, anything that could ever be pinned down, far more so than Johnson, just absolutely opportunistic and with a really, really, really malignant and damaging end in sight, which, he continues to be a real threat and a real negative influence on our politics to this day. And even though it's so evidently the case that he has achieved his position through lies.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? How many of these are men? Like, there's Isabel Oakeshott, and then there's a couple of sideshows like Andrea Leadsom and Gisela Stewart. But why? This is a question I want to ask Raf. Why are we only nominating men?
It's a very good question, isn't it? I mean, Gisela Stewart it was, part of a triumvirate of advocates, in prominent in the Leave campaign, but has subsequently really not been that had a significant role. And I think there is an element of that phenomenon, the revolutionary excitement of just thrilling at the sound of breaking glass, and a sort of there's an inherent machismo in just the pleasure of breaking things for the sake of it, that seems to be sort of excite men in politics more than women, I think. I mean, I'm happy to be corrected on that.
But I mean, the current phase of the Conservative Party and where the right is going, I suppose, you've got your Liz Truss and Kemi Badenoch and Suella Braverman. So that seems to be a form of right-wing populism that everyone can join in.
Yeah, although I think that's different, isn't it? Because there's a sort of an argument. I mean, Liz Truss was a Remainer, remember, in 2016. And there's an argument there, as you said, it's waging an argument, a war on questions of identity and belonging, and in Suella Braverman's case, border control. But it's not that sense of sort of breaking things. The key point in the Brexit, the pivotal moment, I think, really was constitutionally the prorogation of Parliament, and that was Johnson and Rees-Mogg. In a sense, that was where it became an act of constitutional vandalism of the way Britain run. And that, I think, that sort of, there's a public school boy element of recreational vandalism that was involved in. That's a very boyish thing, I suspect.
We've been too rammed for But Your Emails recently, so in a couple of weeks we'll be doing a special section to round up some unanswered questions from our Patreon backers. And in the meantime, we have one from Mark Howson. I've been listening since your first edition and obviously love what you produce. You can stop there. But do you guys think you've made a difference over the past 5 years? Have you changed minds? I know that I am personally much better informed as a result of listening in.
Has the public come to realise that Brexit was a mistake and that this government has been bad for the country? Largely, yes. Were we this is a difficult question for us to ask ourselves, but it should probably be asked, were we partly responsible for the Remain-Leave divide and the subsequent culture wars? Maybe partly, but pointing out the madness was arguably something that we had to do in order to save our own sanity and to try to save the country. And we made a lot of people feel they were going slightly less mad. Which
I think that's a crucial point. I think that sense that people, it's one of the most remarkable things I think about the whole Brexit process is that Remain as an identity, pro-European identity, really came into being on the 24th of June, 2016. And all the way up to the campaign, it really had that be a part of the reason the referendum was lost is because you didn't have the subsequent energy that was created by the shock of defeat. And so in that sense, although, yes, I think the programs like this probably are part of a polarization in some respects. Don't have many leavers on the show. I think that sense of giving people a sense that the leavers didn't get an exclusive claim on what it means to be British. They didn't get an exclusive claim on national identity, and they didn't get to be exclusively patriotic. That was an important space to carve out for a lot of people.
Well, I just want to give people information and jokes. So I think we did that. And I don't know whether we wanted to change minds. I thought actually sort of the point was that we could have a space where we could be properly sort of opinionated and angry and rude sometimes about politicians. And that was actually really important. So I don't think that we were ever expecting that some leaver would tune in. and be persuaded.
I've always tried to understand why Leavers think the way they do. And that is, I think, important. And it kind of counteracts the polarisation a bit. I don't suppose I've always managed it, but I've, over the years, tried to give a sense of how they came to some of the crazier beliefs that they came to. Because for me, that's fascinating. And that's almost the most interesting thing.
I did try. It turns out I'm just not very good at it. And so I leave that to some other people on the Remain side who were sort of more empathetic to that point of view. Next up, the Tories seem desperate to fight the next election on immigration despite the fiasco of the Rwanda scheme and the unstopped boats. And Labour seem desperate to sound equally tough but more competent. That's basically been the shape of immigration politics for most of my adult life, but could it be different? Zoe Gardner is here to show us a better way. So famously, the issue salience of immigration plunged after the 2016 referendum. It's been rising again. How important is it politically right now, and why?
Right now, unfortunately, it is one of the most important political issues. There's two ways to look at why is that. One is simply because we have the government, at least one, if not two or three, sort of single issue parties, and a significant chunk of the media of the country for whom it is, for different reasons, a positive thing to do to make this the issue. And that's why it has grown again in salience, because, 50 weeks out of the year, it's going to be headline news one day of the week. And so obviously people think it's important. Also, it's important in the sense that we're going into an election where, it's very clear, as you say, that the government is going to try to make this an election run on migration, and that when they've almost certainly, my gosh, touch wood, fail at that and fail to be re-elected, their party is looking very likely to become an even more extreme version of an anti-migrant far-right party, and that will be continue to be the issue that they seek to define politics in the UK on. So it's very important for us to tackle it as well from that perspective.
And is it frustrating for you that migration is sort of this big sort of blob of a topic when, of course, that involves, lots of different people? And that can be, somebody coming here because they've been hired for a job. It could be somebody seeking asylum from a war zone. And yet it's all sort of migration. And is the public in different places on those elements?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one of the things that, you look at issue of, third highest salience to the public is migration. Well, if you ask people any kind of polling about migrants, like what do you think should be this or that policy towards migrants, what people are thinking of when you say migrants is refugees who have come on a small boat, because that has been an overwhelming majority of the coverage conversation, what the government is pushing, whereas that actually makes up about, depending on how you calculate it, definitely well under 10%, 5 to 8% maybe of migration to the UK last year, for example. So there's an insane disproportionality in how we talk about this. There's also just the fact that when we talk about it in terms of just numbers and in terms of sort of the framing is just consistently about large numbers, growing numbers, a threat of more numbers. Then obviously people respond. It's not rocket science. People respond with fear and apprehension and thinking that we need greater control, whatever that means, and so on. Whereas as soon as polling asks people about care workers, asks people about the by far the largest group of refugees, which is people who've escaped from Ukraine, asks people about people coming here to join their family members, etc. People have far more nuanced views. The biggest group at the moment, students. People are largely very largely very positive towards migrant students. And then other than that, it's just always about the boats, and it's just it's not accidental. It is deliberate to portray the type of migration that is perceived as most threatening as the type of migration that is overwhelmingly the issue. And it just simply isn't. 30,000 people crossed on a boat last year. It's just, it's such small fry, and it is something that the UK is so perfectly capable of handling humanely without any nonsense with Rwanda. But yeah.
Zoe, Lee Anderson, the right-wing Tory MP, said recently the Tories had failed to address what he calls illegal migration, effectively, as we were just talking about the boats crossing the channel. I'm sure your criteria to what illegal migration is are different to his. But why do you think that they've failed to stop the boats?
I have to give a rather boring evidence-based answer. It's not as colourful or as exciting or probably as emotive as Lee Anderson would make it. The evidence is that people are on the move because they have no safety, no future, no possibility of continuing their lives in the countries where they come from. Some of those people, a very small proportion of those on the move worldwide, have links to the UK or reason to believe the UK is the place where they will be able to rebuild their lives. And they're in a situation of absolute desperation, and they have not found the solutions that they do actually need once, by the time that they have arrived on the French coast. And so they will seek to cross. As long as we close the border, then we create the hole in the border, the official that you can bribe, the smuggling trade, the small boats. And, this is just a shifting of flows that have existed for generations. They're crossing on boats now. Previously, the predominant method was to hide in the back of a lorry. There's some evidence that actually those routes are shifting again now in response to the current government policies. So this is not something new. It is not something overwhelming or scary. It is something tale as old as time. People move, and you can't stop it.
I suppose the charge from the right will always be that the liberal left essentially wants open door immigration. It doesn't actually believe in controls at all. And I think there's a sort of a more reasonable centre right proposition, which is, well, you can make the case in terms of economics, and actually that the government has done that, which is why legal migration is actually going up. They haven't made the case necessarily, but they've actually let lots of people in on work visas. But at some point, sort of contained in that proposition is the fact that there is a limit. That at some point you go, okay, that's you, but not you. And the charge would be that the liberal argument, they don't really want, they're a bit squeamish about conceding that, yes, at some point, perhaps there is a limit and you do need the control, but you just don't want to define it because it's much easier to just be on the opposition side complaining that whatever the right is doing is too draconian. So what's the kind of the liberal response to that? Say, well, yes, at some point there is a limit, but we don't know what it is.
Well, I think there's two sides to my answer. So the first would be that I completely reject this notion of a firm but fair position that we could reach that would satisfy the right-wing politicians or movements that are benefiting so much from pushing always for further and worse policies forever. As long as I've been alive and as long as I've been able to follow politics, there has been a politics of restricting the rights specifically of asylum seekers, but also of all migrants, and of chasing that. And there has never been a moment where anybody on the right has ever said, yeah, okay, we've reached the right point now. And now we have the firm but fair system that we need. And, you can see it at an extreme level now where Rishi Sunak is proposing to send every man and woman who comes across the channel to Rwanda without assessing their needs for protection, a country that has been found to be unsafe by our highest British court, and the right of his party is still baying for more blood. So I am sorry, there is no truth to the idea that there is actually this balanced point where everybody reasonable can just agree at the end. This is not about finding the right solution for the country. This is about building people's political careers, and they won't stop and they won't accept any point of restriction. So that's the first side. And the second side is that what is being presented there is a position that says, oh, you just want to let everybody in and we want to stop people. And it completely negates the reality that people come anyway. What we have now is a massive amount of fortification, militarization, huge expense spent, and deadly and harmful policies being enacted. And nobody would call it control. So what would be a more controlled system would be one in which we actually recognize people's rights to move, the fact that they are there. You're not talking about more people. You're talking about the exact same people, just whether they move in chaos and by paying smugglers, or whether they move through a system that we are in charge of, that we give people papers, that we know who they are, that we make the best of that for everybody. So the choice is not restriction versus open borders. The choice is chaos or control, but the chaos is what we have now, this restrictive policies. They produce the chaos, and control would mean something that recognises the reality that people move and works with that.
Zoe, last November you wrote in Open Democracy, is Labour ready for an immigration overhaul? Is it? How promising are the noises?
Well, I think that it's a mixed picture. And I think that, first of all, what a Labour government has said, what the Labour leadership has said they would do in government is stop some of the immediate worst things that are being done by this government. So random plan would be thrown out. That's incredibly positive. And I think in terms of refugees, that's about as positive as it gets. I'm quite wary that they unfortunately don't have enough of a plan to do the slightly more radical overhaul that is necessary to provide people with alternative routes to come to the UK. That means they don't have to come with smugglers, and therefore fix the issue that people see of people arriving in chaotic and dangerous means. I worry that that's not at least not been communicated yet. They still seem to think that another police patrol in France is going to be the police patrol to finally fix it, which I don't agree with. But on work migration, which is obviously a much bigger issue, I think that there is some positive to look at. I think that there is a serious willingness to look at it from a perspective of workers' rights, to look at the failure of successive Tory governments to adequately enforce labour minimum standards, and to ensure that the visa system does not systematically produce vulnerability among migrant workers to exploitation. So I think that that's really, really positive and will make a massive difference. And of course, when we eradicate or reduce exploitation from the labour market, even if that is aimed towards the most vulnerable group, which is migrants, we all benefit massively.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that about this focus on labour rights, because there has been a history on the left of immigration hawks in the Labour Party and in the union movement on those grounds. So are you sort of saying that actually there is quite an obvious way that you can diffuse that by having, I suppose, a better settlement all around?
Yeah, I think it comes to one of the major issues about how we speak about migration in this country, or rather how we speak too much about migration and too little, and in too little detail, and with far too little honesty about other types of policies. So migration can bring lots of the workers we need to fill labour shortages and to do essential jobs in our economy, but it cannot. Migration policy cannot ensure that labour standards are enforced and that a high livable minimum wage is paid to all workers and that conditions are viable, right? Just as, migrant house builders, migration policy can bring in the skills that we need, and the bricklayers and the electricians and so on, in order to build more housing, but it cannot fix the planning legislations and the utter failure of government or media to hold to account government for failing to have a plan to build sufficient social affordable housing for us. And it goes on. I think we are constantly viewing migration as sort of like the lever that we can pull that is supposed to fix or ruin our country in all of these ways. And in fact, we need to have a country that functions. And then we also need to, have an adequate migration system that recognizes that we need people and that people need to come here and that we can all benefit from that, but it's not going to fix or ruin the entire country, the NHS, the whatever. It's only one part of the puzzle, and we treat it as if it's the be all and end all.
Well, finally, just to be clear, there are certain issues in the political life of a country that are just objectively very difficult. There are really sort of just challenging areas for whichever government with the best will of the world. And I wonder, if you put all the politics to one side, do you think that actually finding a sort of an equitable immigration system that, gives a home to refugees, allows economic migrants in without threatening jobs or making people feel, that they're somehow losing out, is actually something that is very possible.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I would have gone mad with despair and ended it, my career at least, all long ago, if I didn't believe that it was possible. I do very, very strongly believe it is. And what's interesting about migration is it's actually one of these things, if you look at the evidence, that the more you regulate it, again, is what I was saying before, that actually you lose a lot of the control. It sounds counterintuitive, but it's true. If you look at freedom of movement in the EU, it's an extremely successful economic policy, both for sending states and for receiving states and for the migrants themselves. And one of the reasons for that is that most migration in its sort of natural state, quote unquote, is regional, circular. And what freedom of movement does in the EU is it allows that regional and circular movement. And the evidence shows us, refugee migration is a tiny proportion of migration as a whole worldwide. The real drivers of migration is labor, right? People need to support themselves. They go to the places where there are jobs, and where there are not jobs, if they have freedom of movement or if they have, some kind of rights like that, they will then move elsewhere, or they will go back, or even when they reach a higher point in their career, they tend to go back, and that sort of it counteracts the brain drain phenomenon, and it becomes a brain gain. It means that migration is actually not a factor when you look at things like causing unemployment or displacing local workers. It's actually not the case at all. It doesn't stand up to the evidence. But all of that works better when people are free to move, and when you start restricting migration, then you cause these severe inequalities. You create a situation where people have to take these all or nothing longer journeys to stay, regardless of their circumstances, regardless of whether that would be, the most beneficial for them, the economy, for anyone, and stay in some cases, under the radar at serious risk of exploitation, and fueling that cycle in our labour market. So when you make migration freer, it actually benefits us far more, and we actually feel a greater sense of control.
It's the end of the show, so it's time for the stories that went under the radar this week. Raf, what do you have for us?
Under the circumstances, it has to be Brexit, right? Which is the introduction of the paperwork, the bureaucracy for the importation of goods from the single market and the customs union, which had been waived previously, because basically the UK and the Brexiteers realised that would just be a complete nightmare, and even worse for the UK economy than the imposition of the export controls, which the EU already applied back in 2021, has already caused. So although I don't think anyone around here is in the business of bringing in cheese and other, food or animal products from the EU, if we were, we would suddenly find ourselves with a lot of paperwork all of a sudden. But no one wants to talk about it for the reasons that have been discussed on this podcast many, many times before.
Roz?
My under the radar this week comes courtesy of listener Charles Arthur. Hello, Charles. He told me about a woman who went to tribunal because she hadn't paid capital gains tax on a house sale. And in her defence, she submitted a bundle of case law full of plausible sounding cases in which people like her had been let off. But it turned out that either she or her lawyers had asked ChatGPT to come up with a list of cases like this, and it had obliged. The trouble was that it made them up. So the lesson of this is, if you are going to go to tribunal and rely on case law, don't ask ChatGPT for it.
That's amazing. Zoe?
Unfortunately, I have an under-the-radar story of the death of a young man, a migrant, in a lorry in Calais, which happened just a few days ago. I know very, very little about this person. I don't know where he had come from. I don't know his story, what he had fled, what his hopes were, and what he believed he would find in the UK. But I think it's really important that, every single one of those people who die at that border matter as much as I do, as much as you do. They were people just as fully. We're starting to see what looks like an increase in deaths again at the border with France. I recommend everybody to take a look at Open Democracy's series out this week, looking at an investigation into the deaths that have occurred at the French-UK border since 1999 and telling the stories of a lot of those individuals.
Mine is it's about free speech. So we're often told free speech is under threat, including by members of the Free Speech Union. And there were just 2 cases in the past week where it suggested really quite the opposite, that David Miller, former University of Bristol professor who has been accused many, many times of anti-Semitism, won an employment tribunal ruling which said that his anti-Zionism was a protected belief. And I was a bit startled by that. And then I was also startled that Ofcom ruled that it was fine for Neil Oliver on GB News to share a conspiracy theory about how vaccines cause something called turbo cancer. Because it's like, well, people could probably, it wasn't that big a deal and probably could work out that it wasn't true. And so it just seemed to me, well, actually, you know, there are quite robust free speech connections, even for people with colourful views about Jews and fantastical conspiracy theories. And that actually made me a little thinking maybe, in some cases, a little less free speech. And that's the show. Thanks to Roz.
Thank you.
Raf.
Thank you very much.
And our guest, Zoe Gardner.
Thank you.
Stick around for the extra bit after Demon is a Monster by Corner Shop and the traditional salute to the generous supporters who have enabled us to get to the big 500. Remember, your support is the backbone of Oh God What Now, so if you can afford to add to the fighting fund, then please do. Search Oh God What Now Patreon or follow the link in the show notes. Now here's some anniversary thanks to our latest backers.
Hello, many thanks and 500th birthday wishes to new supporters Matthew Frost, Sam Ing and Fiona.
Thanks for your generosity and best wishes from me to Rona, Jack Bergin, P.T. Becker, or P.T. Becker, as I've got here. And also, if that's Jack Burgin, then to you also, Jack Burgin.
And thanks from me to new backers Quinnan Stone, David Go Lightly, and a welcome back to Julian Webb. Thanks, everyone, and happy OGWN Day. We'll see you next time.